The cry in the blizzard, the storm was endless that night. Snow fell from the dark sky like broken glass, cutting the wind and hiding everything in white. The mountains of the frozen colony world were silent except for the roar of the wind. Somewhere deep inside that storm walked a man named Ethan Cole. He was alone, his coat torn, his breath turning into mist as he pushed through the heavy snow. Ethan was once a soldier, but now he was just a wanderer. He had left the cities long ago after the war ended, tired of fighting and killing. He was searching for a quiet place, a reason to stay alive. That night he only wanted shelter before the cold took him. But fate had other plans as he walked. A strange sound cut through the wind. At first, he thought it was the storm playing tricks on him. Then he heard it again, a small, weak cry, almost like a baby. He stopped, listening carefully. The cry came again, faint but real. Coming from the north slope, his heart raced. No one should be out there in such cold. He pulled his rifle closer and followed the sound. His boots sank deep into the snow as the wind tried to push him back. After a few minutes, he saw something, a faint blue light flickering behind a pile of snow and ice. Ethan moved closer and found what looked like a crashed escape pod. It was half buried, its metal frozen. Smoke still rising from one side. The door was open just a little, and the blue light came from inside. He hesitated, gripping his rifle tighter. But then he heard the cry again, this time clearer, softer, desperate. He forced the door open and looked inside. His breath caught in his throat. There, lying on the floor of the pod, was a woman, or something like a woman. Her skin was pale silver with faint glowing lines running across her arms. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow, and in her arms she held two tiny babies wrapped in torn silver cloth. For a moment Ethan just stared. They weren't human. Their faces were too smooth, their skin too bright. But the babies were crying just like human children. The mother's lips moved weakly, whispering words in a strange, soft language. Her eyes opened slowly, glowing faint blue as she looked at him. She was terrified but too weak to move. Ethan lowered his weapon and stepped inside. He could feel the heat escaping from the pod. The air inside was freezing and the baby's skin was turning pale. He couldn't just leave them, war or no war. Species or no species, they would die out there. "It's okay," he said softly, not even sure why. "You're safe now." Of course, she didn't understand. But maybe she understood his tone. She tried to speak again, whispering a single word that sounded like Lyra. Then her head dropped against his arm. Unconscious, Ethan looked around quickly. Searching for signs of danger, he saw scorch marks on the pod. Laser burns. Maybe from a ship. Whoever attacked them might still be nearby. He didn't think twice. He wrapped the babies in his scarf and lifted the alien woman onto his shoulder. His legs almost gave out from the weight, but he pushed on, step by step. The wind screamed louder as he made his way toward an old hunter's cabin he had passed earlier that week. His arms burned and his face stung from the cold. But the baby's cries kept him moving. He whispered to himself, "Come on, Ethan, not now. Not tonight." He couldn't see the path anymore. But he knew the mountain by heart. After what felt like forever, the dark shape of the cabin appeared through the storm. He kicked the door open and stumbled inside. The place was small, empty, and freezing. He laid the woman and the babies on the bed, then rushed to light a fire. The flames flickered weakly at first, then grew brighter, warming the room. Steam rose from their frozen clothes. He pulled a blanket over them and watched as color slowly returned to their faces. The woman's breathing became steady again. Ethan sat on the floor beside the bed, exhausted but relieved. He looked at her closely, her face peaceful now, her arms still holding the children protectively. Something inside him stirred, something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Maybe this was why he survived all those battles. Maybe fate had led him to this frozen world for a reason. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside that little cabin, the fire burned strong. Ethan leaned back, his eyelids heavy. The babies were finally asleep. He whispered quietly, "You're safe now. I've got you." As he closed his eyes, he didn't notice the faint red light blinking on the broken pod outside, a signal beacon still active, calling into the dark night. The hunters had already begun to trace the signal. And the real story was only just beginning. Fire and fear. The cabin was quiet except for the sound of crackling fire. Ethan sat beside it, his face glowing orange from the flames. The alien woman lay on the old bed, Wrapped in blankets, her children between her arms. Outside, the storm still howled, shaking the wooden walls like an angry beast. For the first time in years, Ethan felt the warmth of company. Not human, not familiar, but alive, he kept watching the woman. Her strange silver skin reflecting the firelight. Her eyes were closed, her breathing soft. He wondered who she was, where she came from, and why she was running. Hours passed before she woke. Her eyes opened slowly, 2 glowing circles of icy blue. She gasped and sat up fast, clutching her babies. When she saw Ethan, she froze, fear flashing across her face. Her lips trembled as she whispered something he couldn't understand. He raised his hands calmly, showing he meant no harm. "It's okay," he said softly, pointing to the fire. "Warm. Safe, see?" He smiled, trying to show kindness with gestures. She didn't smile back, but her breathing slowed. Her eyes darted around the room, then back to him. She looked weak but alert, her instincts sharp like an animal protecting her young. One of the babies whimpered, and she held it closer. Ethan reached into his backpack and took out a metal canteen. He poured some warm water into a cup and pushed it gently toward her. She hesitated, then sniffed it carefully before taking a sip. Her shoulders relaxed a little. He noticed her fingers, thin, silver-lined and trembling from cold. Through gestures, he pointed to himself, "Ethan." Then he pointed to her, asking silently for her name. She looked confused for a moment, then touched her chest lightly. "Lyra." Her voice was melodic, almost like music. Ethan repeated, "Lyra." Slowly. She nodded, her eyes softening. For the first time, he saw a small spark of trust. They sat in silence, listening to the storm fade. The firelight flickered on the walls, painting shadows that danced like ghosts. Ethan checked his wrist device. The temperature outside was still deadly. He knew they had to stay hidden until morning. He didn't know who might come looking for her, but the scorch marks on that pod had told enough of the story. He leaned back against the wall and whispered, "You're safe here." Lyra tilted her head, trying to understand. She looked at him, the human who had carried her through the storm. Maybe she didn't know his words, but she understood his eyes. Her expression softened, and she whispered something like a blessing in her language. For a moment, peace returned, then a deep rumble shook the cabin floor. Ethan jumped up, grabbing his rifle. Lyra clutched her children tight, her eyes wide. The rumble came again, louder this time, followed by a faint flash of blue outside the window. Ethan's instincts screamed danger. He looked through the broken slat and saw something moving in the snow. Lights, several of them, creeping through the blizzard. Lyra stood up weakly, pointing at the window. Her voice cracked with fear as she whispered one word, "Hunters?" Ethan didn't know what that meant, but he could read her panic. He loaded his rifle and turned off the firelight, letting darkness fill the room. He moved to the door and peered outside again. Shapes moved slowly between the trees, tall figures, armored, carrying long weapons that glowed faintly blue. They tracked the pod, he muttered under his breath. He turned to Lyra and motioned for her to hide. She understood instantly, crouching down and sliding under the wooden bed with her children. Ethan quietly lifted a metal sheet and covered the fire pit's glow. The cabin fell silent again, only the wind remained. The figures outside stopped near the wreckage of the escape pod. Ethan could see them clearly now, 3 of them, maybe more. Their armor reflected light like ice, their movements precise and inhuman. One of them knelt down and scanned the snow with a glowing red device. Another spoke in a harsh metallic tone. Ethan didn't know the words, but the sound of it felt like death. He held his breath, finger on the trigger, every muscle in his body tense. He remembered battlefields, ambushes, all those times when silence meant survival. Lyra's babies whimpered softly from under the bed. Ethan turned slightly, signaling her to keep them quiet outside. One of the armored figures raised its head. It had heard. A blue light scanned across the cabin door. Ethan's heart pounded like thunder. He aimed his rifle toward the entrance, waiting. The sound of snow crunching under heavy boots grew closer. Lyra's eyes filled with tears as she pressed her hands over her children's mouths. Ethan whispered under his breath, "Not tonight." The door creaked slightly, and a shadow moved across the wall. He could see the figure's outline through the thin wood, tall, heavy, alien. Then suddenly it turned and walked away, the light fading into the snow. Ethan exhaled slowly, sweat running down his face. He waited another long minute before lowering his weapon. Lyra crawled out, trembling, clutching her babies. She looked at him with both fear and gratitude. Ethan whispered, "They'll come back." He checked the rifle's charge and looked toward the frozen forest. The signal beacon was still glowing faintly red in the distance. They needed to move before morning. Lyra nodded as if she understood. She touched his arm gently and whispered, "Thank you, human." The word human sounded strange from her lips, but honest. He gave her a small nod, his eyes steady. The storm outside had slowed. But danger was only growing stronger, and somewhere deep in the snow-covered woods, the hunters were already circling back. The fire had burned low. The night was not over yet. The hunters, the morning came gray and silent. Snow covered everything like a white blanket hiding secrets. Ethan stepped outside the cabin, his rifle hanging by his side. The air was still, too still, the kind of silence that meant something was watching. He looked down and saw it. Footprints in the snow. Not his, not hers, not human. The tracks were deep and wide, made by something heavy and precise. They led straight toward the cabin, then turned away again. Someone had been there while they slept. Ethan's jaw tightened. He followed the trail with his eyes until it disappeared into the forest. "Hunters," he whispered, remembering Lyra's frightened word from last night. He went back inside, locking the door behind him. Lyra was awake now, holding her children, her eyes full of worry. "They were here," he said, pointing outside. She didn't understand all his words, but she saw the fear in his eyes. She whispered something in her language, a prayer maybe. Then she picked up a small metal device from her belt. It was cracked but still glowing faintly. She pressed it, and a small map of blue light appeared in the air. Ethan stared at it, amazed. Tiny red dots flickered on the map. Moving slowly toward their location, he understood immediately. They were surrounded. Lyra looked at him and said one word in English, struggling to form it, "Run," but Ethan shook his head. "I don't run," he said quietly, loading his rifle. He had done enough running in his life. He pointed to the floorboards near the corner, then began lifting them. Beneath was a small crawl space, cold, dark, but hidden. He motioned for Lyra to get in with her babies. She hesitated, then obeyed, her glowing eyes watching him through the narrow gap. When she was safe below, Ethan covered the hole with the boards again and threw a rug over it. He checked his weapon, a charge full. Scope working, one extra cell left, not much, but enough for a fight. He looked around the cabin, turning it into a trap. He placed old oil cans near the walls, bottles near the windows, anything that could make noise if someone entered. Minutes passed like hours. The snow outside began to move again. Ethan peeked through a small hole in the wooden wall. He saw them, 4 tall figures moving through the trees. Their armor was silver and blue, their eyes hidden behind glowing visors. Each carried a weapon that hummed softly. They moved with perfect formation, like machines trained to kill. Ethan took a deep breath, steadying his heartbeat. He aimed his rifle through the hole and waited. The first figure stepped into view. Scanning the cabin with a strange device, Ethan fired. The shot tore through the quiet air like thunder. The beam hit the hunter's chest, throwing it backward into the snow. Instantly, the others reacted, spreading out and returning fire. Blue plasma bolts slammed into the cabin walls, filling the air with heat and smoke. Ethan rolled behind the table, reloading fast. Splinters flew. Glass shattered. He fired again, hitting another in the shoulder. Sparks bursting from its armor. But there were too many inside the floor. Lyra covered her children's ears. Tears ran down her face as she whispered something, words that sounded like a song. Her hands began to glow faintly blue. A soft pulse spread from her palms through the wood above. Ethan suddenly felt the air around him shift, colder, heavier, charged. Then the lights in the hunter's armor began to flicker. Outside, one of them shouted in a robotic voice, "Energy interference detected." Their weapons glitched for a second, giving Ethan time to move. He jumped out the back window, rolling into the snow, and fired from behind a log. Another hunter fell, its chest sparking bright orange. The last 2 turned toward him, firing blindly through the storm, but Ethan was faster, a soldier once more. Silent and deadly, he moved between trees, using the snow and light to hide his steps. When he fired again, his last shot hit the lead hunter square in the head. The armor cracked and the figure collapsed without a sound. Only one was left now, scanning wildly, roaring in anger. It switched to heat vision and saw the cabin. Ethan's rifle clicked empty. He cursed under his breath and sprinted back toward the house. The last hunter aimed at the cabin, ready to fire. Inside, Lyra felt it. She held her babies tight and whispered another word. The blue glow from her hands burst outward, lighting the whole cabin for a second. A wave of freezing air exploded through the doorway. The hunter stopped, trapped mid-step, its armor turning white with ice. Then it shattered like glass, falling in pieces into the snow. The silence returned, broken only by Ethan's heavy breathing. He stepped inside slowly, his eyes wide. The cabin was half frozen, mist hanging in the air. Lyra looked up at him from the floor, weak but alive. Her power had drained her completely. The babies were safe, sleeping in her arms. Glowing softly like small stars, Ethan knelt beside her, touching her shoulder gently. "You did that?" he asked quietly. She smiled faintly, whispering something he couldn't understand. But he didn't need to. Her eyes said everything. She had saved them all. Outside, snow began to fall again, hiding the bodies of the hunters, but among the wreckage, a small device blinked red. Another signal beacon. Somewhere far above the clouds, a ship received it. More hunters were coming, and this time they wouldn't come alone. Blood on the snow. The fire had burned out, leaving the cabin in cold silence. Ethan sat near the door, rifle across his knees. Eyes fixed on the forest outside, he hadn't slept since the attack. The wind whispered through the cracks in the walls, carrying strange echoes, clicks, growls, and distant metal sounds. He knew what they meant. The hunters were regrouping. Lyra sat near the wall, her children wrapped in thick cloth. Her silver skin had turned pale, her energy drained after using her strange power. She looked at Ethan with tired eyes. He was different from any human she had ever heard about, fierce yet gentle. A man who fought not for orders but for others. Ethan checked his rifle again. Only one energy cell left, he gritted his teeth, thinking of old battles where ammo meant life. He turned to Lyra. "We need to move soon," he said. Pointing toward the mountains, she didn't understand the words, but she understood the gesture. She nodded slowly, clutching the twins closer. Just as he stood up, the air filled with a deep humming sound. The roof vibrated, dust falling from the beams. Ethan froze, and that sound wasn't wind. It was engines. He ran to the window and looked up. A dark shape moved through the clouds in a small ship, scanning the ground with red beams. "They found us," he muttered. Lyra's eyes widened, fear flashing like lightning. She whispered something fast and urgent. Ethan grabbed his backpack and motioned for her to hide. But before they could move, the ship fired. A blue beam hit the ground near the cabin, shaking everything. Wood splintered, the roof cracked. Snow and smoke filled the room. Ethan covered Lyra with his body, shielding the twins from falling debris. When the blast ended, the cabin was half destroyed. Cold air rushed in, and through the broken wall, they could see shapes landing from the sky. More hunters, larger, stronger, their armor glowing with red light instead of blue. Ethan cursed under his breath and pulled Lyra toward the back door. They ran through the snow toward the trees. Energy blasts tore through the ground behind them. Exploding in flashes of light, Lyra stumbled, but Ethan caught her arm. Dragging her forward, the twins cried softly, their tiny hands glowing faintly again. The light from them spread warmth through the cold air. Ethan felt it on his skin, calm, gentle, alive. They reached a frozen ridge and slid down behind a fallen log. Ethan peeked over the edge. The hunters were fanning out, scanning the area, their footsteps shaking the ground. He fired one quick shot, hitting the closest one in the leg. The creature fell, sparks flying from its armor. But the others turned instantly, returning fire. Bolts of blue plasma struck the trees, melting the snow into steam. Ethan ducked, reloading fast. He shouted to Lyra, "Stay down!" Even though he knew she barely understood. She pressed the twins close, whispering to them softly. Then, one of the babies suddenly reached out with a small hand. A soft golden light appeared. Floating in the air like dust, it spread across the snow, forming tiny glowing patterns. Ethan felt the temperature shift again, a wave of warmth cutting through the cold. The hunters stopped for a moment, confused, then with a low hum, their visors flickered and went dark. Their weapons malfunctioned. Power dying in their hands, Ethan saw his chance. He rose from behind the log and fired, hitting two of them before they could recover. One of the hunters roared in frustration and charged forward. It swung a glowing blade at Ethan, who barely dodged. The blade sliced through a tree trunk like paper. Ethan rolled, grabbed a piece of broken metal, and stabbed the creature in its chest joint. It screamed, a sound half human, half machine, and fell backward into the snow. Lyra crawled toward him, pulling one of the alien weapons from the ground. She pressed a button and a bright pulse shot out, hitting another hunter square in the chest. The armor shattered, blue light spilling from the cracks. Her breathing was heavy, her body trembling from exhaustion, but her eyes burned bright with determination. When the last hunter fired again, the twins cried loudly. The air shook with their sound. The golden light around them turned blinding white. Ethan shielded his face as a wave of energy burst outward. The snow lifted, trees bent, and the last hunter froze in place. Its armor turned crystal-like, then exploded into fragments. The battlefield went silent again. Ethan slowly lowered his hands. Staring in disbelief, Lyra crawled to her children, holding them close, whispering softly. The light around them faded until only their small glowing eyes remained. Ethan looked around. The snow was covered with shards of alien armor. Blood and ice mixed on the ground, creating a strange, beautiful pattern of red and white. He knelt beside Lyra, panting. "You weren't kidding about hunters," he said. Half smiling, she didn't understand the words, but she saw the relief in his eyes. She reached out and touched his arm. Her hand was warm. Human warm. Ethan realized something then. Something deeper than war or fear. They were no longer strangers. They were survivors, bound by a single truth: protect the innocent. No matter the cost. Above them, the clouds began to clear. A faint light from the rising sun touched the snow. It looked peaceful again, but Ethan knew it wouldn't last. He looked at the sky, seeing small black dots far away. More ships, more hunters. He turned to Lyra and whispered, "We need to run before they come back." She nodded weakly, clutching her twins. The snow around them glowed softly where blood had fallen. The price of survival, and the beginning of something greater. Secrets revealed. The storm was gone by morning. The forest stood quiet, blanketed in white. The world finally still. Ethan sat beside a small campfire, sharpening his knife. His eyes heavy but alert. Lyra rested nearby, her babies wrapped tightly in silver cloth, their skin glowing faintly beneath it. He could see she was getting weaker, not from wounds, but from something deeper. Exhaustion, fear, and grief. Ethan had seen that look before on soldiers who had lost everything. He didn't need to ask what she had been through. He knew somehow that whatever chased her had already taken her home. The twins slept quietly, small hands curled around one another. It was strange. The closer he looked, the more human they seemed. He handed Lyra a piece of dried meat and gestured for her to eat. She took it slowly, studying him. Her eyes were full of something he couldn't name. Gratitude. Maybe, or trust, she pointed to him. "Ethan," she said softly, testing the sound of his name. He smiled, nodding. "Yeah, Ethan." Then he pointed to her. "Lyra?" She nodded and smiled faintly. Her first real smile since the crash. Hours later, when the sky turned gray again, she pulled a small crystal from her bag. It shimmered like frozen light. She pressed it gently, and a stream of blue images filled the air. Memories. Moving like ghosts, Ethan stared in awe, realizing it was some kind of holographic diary. He saw a great silver city floating above an ocean of stars. Then explosions, fire, ships burning as they fled. A voice spoke in her language, full of sorrow, full of farewell. Lyra's eyes glistened as she pointed to herself in one of the images. She stood among a group of people wearing shining white armor. They bowed to her. Then she pointed to her babies, touching their tiny heads. Ethan slowly understood. She wasn't just a refugee, she was royalty. Her children were heirs to something vast and ancient. He looked at her in silence. Unsure what to say, finally he whispered, "So that's why they're hunting you." She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. Her expression grew distant, filled with pain. She traced a line across her chest, the mark of her lost people. Then she pointed to the sky and said one English word, halting but clear. "Home." Her voice cracked when she said it. Ethan sighed and looked toward the mountains. "There's a tower," he said, pointing far to the east where a dark shape rose above the valley. "Old comms tower, maybe still working." He made a motion like sending a signal. Lyra's eyes lit up, she understood. Hope flickered in her for the first time. They packed what little they had and started walking through the snow. The path was long and steep. Ethan led, cutting through ice with his knife. Lyra followed closely, her children strapped to her chest. Every few minutes she looked behind them. Afraid of shadows, the cold bit at their skin, but neither stopped. They walked for hours until the sun dipped low, painting the snow in gold and blood red. At a ridge overlooking the valley, they stopped to rest. From there, the world looked endless. Frozen rivers, black trees, silver skies. Lyra touched the snow and whispered softly, her words melting into the wind. Ethan listened even though he couldn't understand. He realized then that she wasn't praying for safety. She was praying for forgiveness. Night came fast, and they built another small fire under the cover of rocks. Ethan unrolled his old blanket and gave it to her. She refused at first, shaking her head, but he insisted. When she finally accepted, her eyes softened again. She pointed at him, saying slowly, "Why? Help me?" Her voice was uncertain, curious, genuine. Ethan looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Because no one helped me when I needed it," he said quietly. She didn't understand all of it, but she caught the meaning in his face. Her hand reached out, touching his arm lightly. That small gesture spoke more than words ever could. As they prepared to sleep, the twins stirred. A faint golden glow spread from them again. It warmed the air, melted the frost from the rocks. Ethan watched in wonder, whispering, "There's something else." Lyra nodded slowly, whispering back in her tongue, "Chosen." Suddenly, a noise echoed from the distance, the low hum of engines again. Ethan jumped up, scanning the horizon far off. Blue lights flickered in the clouds, hunters, searching, relentless. He clenched his fists and looked at Lyra. She already knew what he was thinking. She nodded, holding her children close. They would not run forever, not this time. The fire burned low, casting long shadows on their faces. Ethan sat awake, staring at the glowing tower far in the valley. It was their only hope, but also their biggest risk. He whispered to himself, "Just one more day." Above them, the stars were cold and endless. Below them, tracks in the snow glowed faintly, red, mechanical, and moving closer. Lyra opened her eyes and saw him watching the darkness. She whispered softly, "Human strong." He glanced back and smiled, tired but proud. He didn't know what destiny had tied them together. But he knew one thing. If death came again, he'd face it before it reached them, somewhere far away. On a ship orbiting above the frozen world, a commander looked at a red blinking dot on his screen and said, "Target found." The hunt was far from over, and the snow was about to run red once more. The bridge of ice. The wind screamed across the valley like a wounded beast. The snow no longer fell gently, it came sharp and fast, slicing against skin and sight. Ethan pulled his hood tighter and leaned into the storm. Beside him, Lyra walked with slow, steady steps, her children strapped close against her chest. Every breath she took turned to mist and vanished into the cold air. They had been walking since dawn. The tower stood far ahead, tall, black, silent. Like a broken finger pointing to the sky, it looked close, but every step forward made it seem farther. Ethan's legs burned, his lungs ached, but he didn't stop. He knew that if they stopped now, they'd never get up again. Lyra stumbled once, almost falling. Ethan caught her arm quickly, his hand strong despite the cold. "You okay?" he asked, though he knew she didn't understand. Still, she nodded, forcing a small smile. Her silver skin shimmered faintly, the blue veins beneath glowing weakly like fading stars. The twins were quiet, too quiet. Their glow had dimmed since morning, their breathing shallow. Lyra's eyes filled with fear every time she looked at them. Ethan noticed, his heart tightening. He wanted to say something comforting, but words felt useless, so he just walked closer beside her, sharing his warmth. The path narrowed as they reached the frozen cliffs. Below was a deep chasm, wide, dark, and endless. A single bridge of ice crossed it, glistening in the faint light like glass. Ethan looked down, feeling the wind howl beneath them. "One wrong step and it's over," he muttered. Gripping his rifle, Lyra stared at the bridge with terror in her eyes. She whispered a word in her language, something that sounded like a prayer. Ethan took the first step, the ice cracking softly under his boot. He turned and motioned for her to follow. She hesitated, clutching her children tight, then nodded and stepped onto the bridge. The ice groaned under their combined weight. Each step echoed through the valley like thunder. Halfway across, Ethan froze. A strange hum filled the air, low, mechanical, rising fast. He looked up and saw it, a shadow slicing through the clouds. A hunter ship, larger than any before, moving directly toward them. Its red scanners swept the ground like hungry eyes. "Move," Ethan shouted, waving at Lyra. She didn't need to understand. She ran, holding her babies close. The bridge shook as the ship fired a plasma beam that hit the cliff beside them. Chunks of ice exploded, falling into the abyss below. Ethan grabbed Lyra's hand and pulled her forward. The bridge cracked behind them, splitting apart like thin glass. They ran as the wind roared and the ship fired again. A second blast struck the far end of the bridge. For a heartbeat, everything slowed, then the bridge began to collapse. Ethan pushed Lyra ahead, shouting, "Go!" She stumbled onto solid ground, landing hard in the snow. He jumped after her just as the bridge shattered completely. Behind them, the icy walkway fell into the abyss, disappearing into darkness. The ship circled overhead, scanning for them. Ethan and Lyra crawled behind a cluster of rocks. He looked up and saw a metal hatch half buried in snow. A maintenance tunnel. "This way," he whispered, pulling it open. They slipped inside just as another beam tore through the ridge. The tunnel was dark, silent, and smelled of rust and ice. They followed it until they reached an opening that led straight to the base of the tower. It was taller than Ethan had imagined. Old, ancient, built from black alloy that shimmered faintly with alien symbols. Lyra touched the metal with shaking hands, her eyes glowing bright again. "This home signal," she whispered in broken English. Ethan nodded, watching as she activated a control panel buried in ice. Blue light spread through the tower like veins waking from sleep. The hum grew louder, filling the valley with sound. But the ship above wasn't gone. It descended slowly, landing nearby. Its doors opening with a hiss, dozens of hunters stepped out. Their armor red and black, their eyes glowing. Ethan tightened his grip on his rifle. Lyra turned to him, tears in her eyes, shaking her head. She didn't want him to fight alone. The tower's light pulsed brighter. A beam of energy shot upward into the sky, a signal reaching for the stars. Lyra screamed something in her native tongue. Pressing her crystal against the console, the twins woke, their glow intensifying. Their small hands reached toward the tower's light, and the beam turned golden. It wrapped around them. Filling the air with warmth and color, Ethan stood between the hunters and the tower. He fired until his rifle clicked empty. Then he drew his knife, ready for the end. "Come on, you bastards," he muttered, blood running from his arm. The first hunter charged, but before it could strike, the golden light exploded outward. It swallowed the valley in blinding brilliance. The air trembled, the snow lifted, and everything went silent. When Ethan opened his eyes, the hunters were gone. Only broken pieces of armor remained scattered in the snow. Lyra was on her knees beside the twins, her eyes glowing brighter than ever. The signal tower continued to hum softly. Sending its light into space, Ethan fell to his knees beside them. Breathing hard, he didn't know if they had won. But for the first time, he felt peace. Lyra looked at him. Tears of relief in her eyes, she whispered. "Help!" came. He followed her gaze upward. Through the storm clouds, shapes began to appear. Ships, dozens of them, silver and blue, descending from the stars. Her people had heard her call, and the long night was finally breaking. The dawn rescue. The night was ending for the first time in days. Light touched the frozen valley, soft and golden. The tower stood tall and alive, humming with quiet power. Steam rose from the cracks in the snow as the air grew warmer. The storm was gone, replaced by calm wind that carried the scent of life. Ethan opened his eyes slowly, his vision blurred, his body weak. Pain burning through his side. He looked down and saw blood frozen against his coat. His hand trembled as he tried to push himself up. Nearby, Lyra knelt beside him, her hands glowing softly as she pressed them over his wound. He winced, but she shook her head gently. "Stay still," she whispered in broken English. Her voice was weak but full of care. The light from her hands seeped into his skin, closing the wound bit by bit. Ethan could feel warmth spreading through his chest, a strange calm washing over him. When he looked up, he saw the sky. It wasn't empty anymore. Dozens of ships drifted down through the clouds, silver and blue shining like stars made of metal. They moved in formation, silent and graceful. Lyra watched them with tears in her eyes, whispering something that sounded like a prayer. The ships landed across the frozen plains, melting snow beneath their engines. From them came tall figures dressed in white armor marked with glowing blue lines. Their weapons were lowered, their steps cautious. They looked around at the destroyed hunters scattered in the snow, then at the humans standing among them. One of them approached Lyra. Speaking quickly in their language, she replied softly, her voice trembling with emotion. Ethan couldn't understand the words. But he could see it in her eyes, relief, gratitude, love. The soldier bowed deeply to her, then turned to Ethan and did the same. Ethan blinked, surprised, almost awkward. He wasn't used to being treated like a hero. Lyra smiled faintly through tears. She placed a hand on his cheek, whispering, "You save us." Ethan smiled back. "You would have done the same." She shook her head slowly. "No. Human heart. Different." He didn't know what to say, so he just held her hand for a moment. Her touch was warm, no longer alien, no longer strange. Two of her people came forward and lifted Lyra's twins with great care. They wrapped them in silver cloth that glowed brighter under the sun. One of the twins reached out toward Ethan. Tiny fingers glowing faintly gold, Ethan leaned closer, letting the baby touch his hand for a second. He saw a flash in his mind, and stars, light, and peace. It felt like a promise. Lyra stood slowly. Supported by her people, she looked back at the tower, its signal still pulsing into the sky. Her mission was complete. Her people were safe. But her eyes lingered on Ethan. She stepped forward, pressing a small crystal into his hand. It shimmered faintly with blue light. "For you?" she whispered. "So, you remember?" Ethan looked at the crystal, confused. "What is it?" he asked softly. She smiled, her voice gentle. "Memory of hope." Then she turned away, walking toward the open ramp of her ship. Her people followed, carrying the twins, their soft cries echoing faintly through the cold air. Ethan stood there watching as the ships prepared to leave. Engines hummed low, snow swirling in golden light. He felt something deep in his chest. Pride, sorrow, and peace all mixed together. He had spent years searching for a reason to keep living, and somehow, he had found it in a frozen valley with a woman from the stars. The first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds. The entire sky turned orange and silver, reflecting off the snow like glass. As the ships rose into the sky, Lyra looked down from the ramp. Her eyes met his one last time, glowing blue and full of unspoken words. She raised her hand, a silent goodbye. Ethan raised his in return, smiling faintly. He whispered, "Safe travels, Lyra." The ships vanished into the clouds, leaving behind trails of light that faded slowly. Silence returned to the valley, but it was a peaceful silence this time. Ethan stood alone beside the tower, the crystal still glowing in his palm. He looked at it and chuckled softly. "Guess I'm not as useless as I thought." He turned toward the rising sun, its warmth kissing his face. Behind him, the tower pulsed one last time and went still. The signal had done its job, and the world was quiet again. Ethan began walking down the slope, his shadow long against the snow. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he wasn't just a wanderer anymore. He was the man who helped save a mother, 2 children, and maybe a whole world. And somewhere out among the stars, Lyra would remember his name. The valley shimmered in golden light. The wind carried the faint echo of a voice, soft, distant, and full of peace. "Thank you, human," it whispered. Fading into the dawn, Ethan smiled, looking up at the sky. "Any time," he murmured, as the light swallowed the snow. And so ended the story of the man who saved an alien mother and taught a distant race what it truly meant to be human.